Fred and I have, he's been a radio talk show host for years. First here in Hawaii. You've been on a station that got banned for a while. I mean, it shut down, lost its license, right?
First show.
Yeah, wow, okay. So much for freedom of speech here in the arts. But then he got onto a number of other radio stations. We always had the greatest of guests. I think he knew everybody in the Liberty Movement. He had guests on his show, David Friedman, Murray Rothbard, Roy Childs, you name it. Anybody that's been anybody in the history of the Liberty Movement, he had them on his show. He even invited me to come down and do a in costume show on radio, because he was dressed up as Thomas Paine. I was supposed to come down and look, or at least talk like Adam Smith, which didn't fool anybody. And it was so funny, and good thing you couldn't see it on the radio, because he had this putty nose, because Thomas Paine had a big nose. So he had a big putty nose, and throughout the show, it was a hot room, it kept drooping. Before long, he looked like the Wicked Witch of the West, with a long pointy nose and a little drip of water at the end. Anyway, we had some great time. Then he went up to Alaska with Lisa, and he had radio shows and television shows up there. He worked for Representative Vic Coring up there too, and now he's living in Washington State. They're both there. Okay, so it's been a fascinating topic of interest for Fred and for me and for others. This topic about Abraham Lincoln. So, Fred, take the show away.
Thank you. And the night that Kenji and I did Adam Smith and Thomas Paine was a big success, I think. I still have that tape, by the way. And yeah, the nose dripped. And the reason we dressed up is because that was my first year anniversary. And unbeknownst to the management of the radio station, I invited every libertarian in town. A couple hundred people came through there during that time, do you remember?
Yeah.
And so they all saw our costumes. I have something important to talk to you, everybody, about tonight, and unfortunately it's not a glib, funny, although there are certain aspects that are funny. You can find it even in violence. I'm going to talk to you about a 4-year period of incredible violence controlled by a politician. And I'm going to build a case tonight slowly, a lot faster than I thought because I'm half it for time, but that the question was Abraham Lincoln a saint or a sinner? Is he worth all those monuments to him or not? And I confess, after doing a lot of research and reading it and cross-checking, that I'm very angry at myself and at the American historians for conning us for so long and turning what I call a dictator into a hero. 2 primary references. This one is by a libertarian named Thomas D. Lorenzo. It's called The Real Lincoln, and most libertarians are aware of it. Since then, he's written one called Lincoln Unmasked, and it just outlines clearly what Lincoln did. And because I am a careful guy, I wanted to read a version, another historian. This guy is an award-winning historian named Donald Herbert. Can you read his last name? I have mental blocks. David Herbert Donald. And he maintains that the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, is the most heroic and courageous and wonderful guy that ever lived. And so that's a couple hundred pages of the exact opposite opinion of my first guy, D. Lorenzo. And D. Lorenzo writes in his book that of all the various critics I have, not a single one takes my facts and says, you're wrong, he didn't do what you claim he did. In other words, tonight it's quite interesting because none of the facts that I'm going to give you, and I'm going to give you a bunch of facts in a minute or two, they're not checked. I mean, they're checked, counter-checked, and checked again, like Jay Leno does. And he was photographed. He wrote letters. people knew him and wrote about him. There were editorials up and down the country, from California to the East Coast. I mean, this was pretty modern times. I mean, this wasn't the time of writing letters and having them take 6 days to cross a couple, 10, 15 miles. This is where they had telegraphs that could cross the country in seconds. So this is the first modern war, and I would say first modern president. And it's an embarrassment to be. I'm from Winnetka, Illinois, the land of Lincoln. I once took a train from Chicago, and I bisected that state slowly, going through the capital where he was a lawyer, through a lot of these little towns where Lincoln used to ride the circuit with the judges, down to St. Louis. And it is a voluptuously beautiful state. It's all flat, a few hills, and pregnant. They're all making corn and soybeans and all sorts of food. And to have this politician, the land of Lincoln, it says on all the license plates. And now to discover, when I'm slightly over 23, quite as old as Kenji, help me, to realize that I've been conned for all these years. I never trusted him because he's a politician, but hero, no, and that's what I'd like to build the case. Now, just for fun, we all know about, I'm going to have a little quiz here. We all know about the Civil War, right? How many soldiers died in the Civil War? How many casualties were you? Does anyone know offhand? You've been? Deaths, yeah, died. Huh?
Over 600,000.
Over 600,000. Do we?
I agree with that.
600,000.
600,000. That's the traditional figure. 625,000. Well, there's been recent studies. You can look them up on Google. They have a little bit more sophisticated ways of checking, because they were notoriously, because the checkers and the company clerks would get killed, and so they just would lose hundreds of names. A lot higher. It's up to 8 to 8.5. It's pushing 1 million. And now this is getting scary. Now, these didn't just die, they died gruesomely. They died by being cut in half, or having half a face shot off, or their groin, or a leg, and in agonizing pain. This is serious stuff, and it could have been stopped at any point along the way. Check it. The newspapers will tell you so. Okay, now let's see how worse it is. How many we got how many soldiers, but how many people died in the big war, the Second World War? Anybody know? American soldiers, sailors, seamen, Air Force, all together. How many American men and women died?
A few 100,000.
How many?
A few 100,000.
Yes, like 300,000.
How many?
Less than the
300,000?
Civil War.
You're right, that's my point. 425,000 is their figure, but that's 200 to 400,000 less than this war.
Right.
And this war was it made the First World War, I'm sure you've seen movies where they have these aerial scenes of these men all clashing and dying. It's insanity magnified. This was the first vicious, horrible war. So we really have a problem here. We're dealing with serious stuff. I don't ever want to see it happen again. And let me introduce you now to Abraham Lincoln. And this is going to be the fun part. Kenji, check me on this. Okay? This is a very traditional definition of Lincoln. Ready? Abraham Lincoln, 16th President of the United States, serving from March 1861 until his assassination, April 65. Lincoln led the United States through the greatest constitutional, military, and moral crisis that we're talking about here, the American Civil War, preserving the Union, abolishing slavery, strengthening the national government, and modernizing the economy. And I'll stop right there. What's wrong with that?
Well, Fred, is this a fair assessment?
From a statist point of view, it is. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. The other day I was watching Seattle News, and the woman says, today the city council has decided to get rid of trans fats. No more trans fats. Oh, we'll be healthier, yay! And they did it without blinking an eye. And I thought, what the hell are we coming to? The government's telling us how to eat. And And there's no opposition whatsoever. Oh yeah, we shouldn't eat trans fat. We're all marching along over the cliff. This is serious stuff. And we don't even notice it. We need to be shaken and stirred. And so, all right, so preserving the Union. Wait a minute. A union, we had a voluntary union up until then. We had seceded from the Great Britain. We were a nation of individualists who volunteered to form a voluntary union, a United States. And here he's going to preserve this with guns? No. The right to secede was fully granted then, and the northern newspapers, and of course the southern newspapers, but many people argued, what is Lincoln doing? Of course they have the right to secede. Who said this? James Buchanan, the 15th President of the United States. He said that in a speech when he left the White House in January of 1861. So even someone that close. So what the issue number one is that Lincoln created out of whole cloth new ideas about the Constitution. They were lies. He twisted it around. Oh no, of course it's illegal. And he appointed people to the Supreme Court who ultimately decided that in favor of him. They said, oh yeah, seceding from the United States, oh, that's illegal. And they created it out of whole cloth. And that's what I want to deal with today. All right, and we all know about these horrendous casualties. And I wanted to start by saying that from the Declaration of Independence, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. What does that mean? Huh? What's consent mean?
At a gunpoint?
No! You gotta agree to it. Were you ever asked to be Obama's thrall? No. Okay, so let me build up these cases now. Here are the specific things Lincoln did. In general, he fought his Civil War. His critics called it Mr. Lincoln's War. And why did they say that? Because at any time during those 4.5 bloody years, he was besieged by one representative after another to stop it. He had people from the South, he had people from France, people from Canada, people from the Soviet Union, it wasn't called that then,
Russia.
Imperial Russia, were even in on the act. But he ignored them and he refused to receive them. He refused to say at any point that the southern states constituted a legitimate government. He regarded them as rebels. And since he was the top dog, that attitude went downhill through his generals down to the troops, and it led to vast cruelty and killing and murder and robbing and raping and burning and ultimately to Sherman's swath of destruction through Georgia to the sea. Now, for you people from Asia and all that, have you read about these things? It was a bloody, bloody time, and they justified it because we can't have these rebs leaving our country. So they were going to put together a hobgoblin marriage with a gun. Are you going to stay married to a girl with a gun on her head all the time? No. So what Lincoln did was con the people. And how did he do it? He used slavery as the issue. Oh, them slave owners. That's how he did it. He threw in the emotional aspect, the young soldiers that he conscripted, by the way. And he gave them a good reason to fight, and that is that the Southerners were all slaveholders, which, by the way, is not true. Very few of them. The poor white farmers didn't have slaves. But anyway, so there's another issue. The second issue, this is a fact. Abraham Lincoln instituted the military draft. What is the military draft?
Slavery.
Yes, you too. Or as Rothbard would say, quoting him, the military draft is the government taking a young fellow by the scruff of his neck, out of his family, his home, his state, putting him in uniform, and subjecting him to death on the battleground. Not a nice thing to do, and unconstitutional. He didn't give consent. How did he do it? Well, how did he get away with all these things? I'll get to that later. Lincoln suspended the right of habeas corpus very early on, in about 1861, at the start of the war. And he never dropped that the rest of the war. You had no rights. What is habeas corpus? Can anybody define it real quick? What is it?
Bring the body in person rather than incarcerate him indefinitely.
Well, yes, but also it
To know
means...
what you're being charged.
And the right to confront, the right to have a hearing and not just be held forever. The right to engage all the legal mechanisms. That was suspended by Lincoln for the entire war. Now suppose Obama were to do that. Fox would go wild. I mean, then we'd have a legitimate thing to get rid of him. Lincoln and the rest of his apologists for the war began claiming that it was to free the slaves, when in fact his Emancipation Proclamation only covered, in other words, it was relevant only to the blacks within the sphere that the Union Army controlled, which up until about 1864 was nothing. So he didn't free anybody, and even the abolitionists didn't like that. They liked the sentiment, but they realized, hey, it doesn't mean anything. And so once again, the guy that got rid of slavery didn't get rid of slavery. Am I doing okay?
Yes, I'm curious. But wasn't war the only way to free slaves across the Western Hemisphere?
No, and I'm glad you asked, because Lincoln, was aware of John Wilberforce. His name was William Wilberforce, and he also knew the actor that played him in that thing yesterday. The actor was not Ralph Fiennes; it was Lone Gifford. He was that's a Welsh name, handsome young actor. He played him. So he knew that the concept of compensated emancipation. Anybody not know what that means? Compensated emancipation.
Buy the slaves free. Buy them back.
Pardon me?
Buy them back.
Buy them back.
Buy them. Well, they couldn't be literally, but the owners of the slaves who wielded much political power were paid off. And this happened all over Europe, all over England, all over South America. Not one battle was fought over it. They paid off the guys that had slaves mostly, and that was the end of slavery. Chattel slavery ended 40 years in some case, 20 in most, before the Civil War began. And he being Lincoln, he even raised that issue, but he was smoked down by all the people that already were making too much money in the war effort. So he was aware of it, yeah, but he didn't do it. And one of the reasons is he wasn't really fighting that. He was fighting to keep the Union as one, and all those Southern import duties going into national treasuries. Lincoln and the rest of the apologists used that. Now, let me go to another one. Lincoln killed, well now, he didn't literally kill, he was responsible for the ongoing slaughter of up to 800,000 people. And he knew in advance that Europe, here's your question, answered. He knew in advance that Europe did it without this. Now, how the Europeans didn't come down on him, I don't know why. He also created a notion, which again was throwing the Constitution away, that the right of succession was not in existence. He said everybody knows it's illegal. The northern newspapers said no, we've had the right of succession from the beginning of this country. This country's based on it. And so if you think that he didn't have to fight northern newspapers, you're wrong. He did. The North wasn't for him at all. Many of them, all the way up to the end of the war, were ready to rebel. And so what did he do about that? Well, let's see what he did. Lincoln launched a military invasion without Congress's approval, which caused the Southerners to all get that at Fort Sumter. What did he do about that? He imprisoned thousands of Northern citizens without trial, without habeas corpus. For what charge? For opposing his policies. for the crime of deviationism, which is what they had in Russia later. If you disagreed with them and you were influential enough, the federal troops would come, usually it was newspapers, break up your presses and put you in jail and leave you in there without a trial. And he got away with that. Why? Because he internalized it. It's against the United States. It's against our security. Does that sound modern? And, we can't have people talking against the war. Men are dying out there for you. Don't you care about them? I mean, it just twisted it all. Therefore, you don't have any free speech rights. And he got away with it for the most part. And one reason was, well, why didn't they take it to court? Because they weren't sure themselves. It was a new government. Lincoln, when he first got into Washington, didn't know what to do. He didn't even know where to go. He knew that the president lived in the White House, but that's about it. He didn't know that he in order to give an order to a troop down here in Florida, he didn't tell the troop what to do. He told his Secretary of Defense, who told the generals, who told the colonels, who told him. He didn't know any of that. Well, either did the people. It was simultaneously naive and. Let's go on. So he created the notion that secession was illegal, but he did it out of whole cloth. And the colonists seceded from England a mere 84 years earlier. In other words, 2 or 3 generations. There were probably old people alive that knew old people before them that had been rebels from England. It was that close. And yet he's trying to turn around the right of succession that doesn't exist. No, it's not true. Lincoln imprisoned dozens of opposition newspaper publishers using federal troops to do it. Yeah, I covered that. Lincoln deported. There's another thing. You don't like what I say? Out. There was this famous case of an American politician, and he has a hard to pronounce last name. Kenji, can you pronounce it?
I forgot, but it's
Vandenham.
Yeah.
Vandenham, and he was from Cleveland, Ohio. Mm-hmm. And he had been a long-term opponent of all of these things we're talking about. He opposed the war. He opposed the fact that Lincoln was saying that it's illegal to secede. Of course it's legal to secede. A lot of intellectuals of that day were writing newspaper articles and speeches that, yes, indeed, of course it's legal. And Lincoln couldn't have that. So he took that man, federal troops took that man, and literally they charged him with all sorts of military charges. The guy was a politician, he wasn't in the military. They charged him and they had a trial, a military trial. Guess who won? They did. And you know what they did? Well, they were going to put him in prison for the rest of his life. And there's a hullabaloo over it because he was a pretty well-known guy. So Lincoln said, okay, I'll commute that sentence, but I'm going to deport him to the South. So he deported him to south of the Mason-Dixon line and into the Confederacy. That's what he did. That's the example of what he did to his opponents. All right, here's another one. Well, also, he did that he took an entire state legislature, one in Indiana. He grabbed it and put it in jail for a while because they were about to declare that they no longer wanted to have any Indiana troops in the war. His troops surrounded the Indiana State House. They grabbed him, put him in prison, and only later did they let him go. That's how bad it was. Lincoln he deported a number of people to the South because of that. And Lincoln also approved the generals making war on civilians. Did you know that? You always see these movies where it's the gray versus the black, and I'm going to shoot you. Oh, no. Toward the end of the war, they were so desperate because General Lee was twice as smart as any of his generals put together. And so finally he got 2 generals who would just kill anything in their path, Sherman and General Grant. And these 2 kind of plugged their way, and they had massive, they outnumbered the South about 3-1, and so they just, And finally they committed this policy of total annihilation. And Sherman did it. He marched from places in Georgia and made about a 20-mile wide swath that went southeast through, and that's where the movie
Gone with the Wind.
Gone with the Wind. They went right through there and burned everything. They burned land, they burned crops, they burned homes, they burned everything. And the idea was to keep all of this stuff away from the South and weaken them. And they also killed a lot of civilians. And they did a lot of other things to them. It was, in every sense, a barbarous, Nazi-like thing. And yet Sherman and Philip Sheridan, who worked for him, now have streets named after him in Illinois. I know. I grew up near there. So he had his generals do that. And Lincoln was widely credited with, quote, saving the Union. You've heard that. Right? He saved the Union. But did he? What do we? Is the United States government the same now as it was when it was truly a voluntary institution? It's no longer a place where you can go argue your case. It's a place where you're told what to do. That's a simple way of putting it. It's federal rich. The federal is now the supreme law and everything in the land. And this is far different than it was beforehand. I wish all of you could have heard a radio show I did once with Rothbard. He was asked, well, what about the Constitution? What do you think of that, Dr. Rothbard? And he said, well, it's quite interesting, Fred. He had a New York accent. Very interesting, Fred. There was two groups of guys, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And the good guys were all the people that advocated individual liberty. Jefferson, and he was the crew on that side, wrote the Declaration of Independence, which is one of the few political documents I read and it makes the hair go up on my arms. I love that document, it makes me cry. And then I don't forget which is which, but the other ones that wanted a powerful government. And the
Federalists wanted
the Federalists want the powerful government, and they wanted a bank. They wanted a government bank. They wanted government. And what symbols did Mao have? Government. Yeah. And so the Jeffersonians won for a long time until the Civil War, when the Federalists took over philosophically, and then physically they did. And each one of these things I've just told you, you can look it up, and you'll find that it's a fact. The people like this will admit it. They admit everything, but they just say, oh, well, it was necessary. But as you pointed out, it's not necessary. Okay, now let's talk about Fort Sumter. It is well known that the South shot the first shot, right? And therefore, they're responsible. All Mr. Lincoln was doing was defending the United States government, right? Wrong, and I'll show you how. Fort Sumter is this tiny, ever seen it, by the way? It's this tiny little joint surrounded by two rivers in south, indefensible. It's a crummy place for a fort, but and the fort was manned by Union officers. The guy's name was Robert, what was his name? Major Robert Anderson was in charge. And it had no significance to the United States government at all, except the fact that it was still there and it was in the heart of Confederate territory. Now the Confederates had sent an open message to Mr. Lincoln, you may have your troops back. We don't want them. We want we're going to take over that place, but we're not going to hurt them. They have free leave to go. That's very important. How many of you knew that about Fort Sumter and about that particular, were you aware of that? Oh, you probably read it.
Yeah, we visited.
Yeah, okay. Did you guys know
They're
that?
going East Coast.
The point, I want to emphasize it once again. Before Fort Sumter was shot upon, the South clearly said, we don't want to shoot you. Go from our land, because it's ours now. And then they also said, A, we're going to pay our share of the national debt up until when we seceded, and B, we're going to pay for these guys to get out of here. Okay, you didn't know that? Check on it. And if you do, you'll say, ooh, that nutty guy was right. Ooh.
The Southern General
Beauregard.
graduated from West Point with Anderson. They were classmates.
Oh,
That's
really?
right. And Robert E. Lee.
Personal friends.
Yeah, Robert E. Lee lived in Washington. The North wanted him to be their general. But he took, because in those days, the state is where your loyalty was, your own state, and he picked Virginia. Which, anyway, so the start of Mr. Lincoln's War happened, as they say, the South did fight, it did shoot first, but here's how it happened. This little, as I said, this little tiny fort down there, and this is not new. It was debated in newspapers for weeks before it ever happened. And when did it happen? Who knows the date offhand? I think, no, you know,
No.
cheating. I think it was April 12th, 1861, real early. And what happened was that Lincoln, well, he brought all his officers and his generals in and says, what should we do about this fort? And by the way, Buchanan, the outgoing president, said there's no way to defend that fort, just get them out of there. Retract your troops. General Winfield Scott, the great general of the War of Incursion.
What War of Incursion?
You mean you're not familiar with the War of Incursion?
It sounds like a quibbling word for it.
Anybody know what that was?
1812. War of 1812?
No. See, I'm deliberately picking what the Mexicans called it.
Oh.
It was the Mexican-American War. If you just take a real broad look at that, the Americans just moved in, took over, fought the Mexicans and won, and then they became Texas. And then, oh, you can't do that, so they sent Winfield Scott down to Mexico.
Does that mean that the North actually helped Texas secede?
That's
from
exactly
Mexico?
right. Perfect point. 20 years earlier, the North helped Texas secede from Mexico. And so, not only...
And Lincoln was a soldier in that war, too.
he was with the Illinois militia,
Okay.
and he fought nothing.
Okay.
And so, it's all right. So they have this little fort down there, and they're deciding what to do about it. And most of the people, Buchanan said retract him. His general, Winfield Scott, said it's impossible to defend that. We can't go down there. In order to make it happen, we'd have to have 200,000 troops. And the reason is technical. Fort Sumter is inland a bit, and it's a huge basin down there, and it's where all these floodwaters come in, two rivers come in, and so you can't take big warships up there because it's too shallow of a draft. So what they did is they knew they couldn't make a naval engagement of it. The only way to go rescue these guys or take them out, well, why don't we stop and just say, wait a minute, the South said they could go. Why? Because they didn't intend on letting them go. They had intended on keeping them there, resupplying them and making war on the South, but make it look like it was the South's fault. That's the point. They conned us. They conned us supremely, because yes, the South shot first. Okay, Lincoln decided against the advice of, and I even wrote it down, Fort Sumter, Buchanan, Scott, Horace Greeley, remember him? Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune. He encouraged a plan whereby the Southerners would be allowed to go in peace and that no war should be fought to force them to remain in the Union, thus the same with Fort Sumter. The people at Fort Sumter, the South would have it, but the Northern troops would be allowed to go back free. Stephen Douglas, the congressman whom Lincoln had debated earlier, Stephen A. Douglas, he pointed out that South Carolina was entitled to it, and that the Anderson, that's the commanding officer down there, and his gallant band be instantly withdrawn. In other words, people were advising Lincoln, don't do that, it's going to start a war. Lincoln wanted there to be a war. It was Mr. Lincoln's war. There's the proof. And then there's a lot more of it. I'm just talking for 20 minutes. He did that. So he outruled his officers, telling them not to do it. He formed a naval brigade, took a couple of battleships, and then also vessels with not too deep bottoms, and went down there, and they look here, what did the South see? They see all these battleships and everything coming, oh, there's going to be a war. So they began to bombard Fort Sumter. And I'm almost done here. Here's where there's a little humor. You ready? This is funny. This is written by one of the guys that was there. The firing. This is the Southerners bombarding Fort Sumter. The firing continued all day, although much less rapidly, since the Union fired aimed to conserve ammunition. The crashing of the shot, the bursting of the shells, the falling of the walls, and the roar of the flames made a pandemonium of the fort, wrote Abner Doubleday. The fort's large flag staff was struck and the colors fell to the ground. And a brave lieutenant, one Norman J. Hall, bravely exposed himself to enemy fire as he put the stars and stripes back up. That evening the firing was sporadic, but with an occasional round landing on or in Fort Sumter. That's the truth. On Saturday, April 13th, Anderson surrendered the fort. Incredibly, no soldiers were killed in this battle. They did try to kill him. The generous terms of surrender, however, allowed Anderson to perform a 100-gun salute before he and his men evacuated the fort the next day. The salute began at 2 p.m. on April 14th, but was cut short to 50 guns after an accidental explosion killed one of the gunners and mortally wounded another. Thus starting a 4-year tradition of military ineptitude on the part of the North. And then the men marched out, they weren't fired upon, and boarded a boat that ferried them to the Union battleships outside the harbor. They were greeted as heroes on their return to the North. So there's Fort Sumter. I think you might leave here. Well, I don't know about that guy, but if you take the time to go look, they're screwed. We've been told things that aren't true. The man was a dictator. Now, finally, let's bring this back to, I'm almost done.
Okay.
No actors hook?
Hi Fred, excuse me as a please excuse my ignorant because I'm a foreigner. I didn't study history of America. So I want to know, before the Civil War start, what's the status? Is it the North and South? Is it already the United Nations?
No, United States. Yeah, the United States.
It's already in the federal, it's already started? Or only after? Because there's the saying, well, from some of the historical material I heard, Lincoln's supposed like the father of the United States.
No.
Because,
of the current United States.
Yeah.
Of the modern United States.
Yeah.
The top-heavy United States.
Okay.
The government tell you what to do, United States.
There's already each state is already under the federal.
Yes.
It is, but
Yes.
it wasn't half as bad. There was no income tax. There was no draft.
Okay.
And each state regarded itself as sovereign, and they thought, well, we don't want, if there's anything that the federal government does that is egregious, we will simply walk out.
Okay.
And
So
let me
it's not like
let me
the,
finish, then we'll go
independence
talk.
War from the British colony. It's not like that.
No, it was one country, pretty much.
It's already.
And they had federal and local laws that encouraged slavery. The government had laws that encouraged chattel slavery. Without those laws, there would have been no chattel slavery.
Just because at that time each state has a pretty much powerful around
That's
their
right.
own
But
stuff.
they all were governed by the Constitution. Anyway, let me finish with this. I want to bring it back to a comparison. Okay, and you're all going to get it. I'm going to see your eyes getting big as I say this. You already know, but it's a surprise for Elisa. Here's my finale, everybody. Finally, let us take a wider look at military dictatorships and the kind of men who took to them. A mere 65 years before Mr. Lincoln's War, another military dictator fought his final battle which allowed him to become the supreme ruler of the area he conquered. In 1795, aided by cannons and muskets bought from western sea captains and merchants, a local muscle man managed to force his opponents into a high bluff where they had the choice of marching headlong into the cannons, muskets, and clubs of their opponents, or jumping off a high bluff about 500 feet to their deaths. Now we start to have, already we see this. This was in May of 1795. The winner became a famous ruler, just as Lincoln did 65 years later. Both had statues created of them, large and small. Both were revered as saviors of the people and or uniters in the first case. He united his people. They were military dictators. Two men behind massive killing, Lincoln and Kamehameha I. Kamehameha united the islands. How did he do this? By killing more efficiently than his opponents. Lincoln was the savior of the Union. How did he do it? By killing more than 500,000 souls and lying about the right of secession, claiming it to be illegal. These are grim but true facts. So, now that you know them, I hope that you will think about them and see how much we've been conned. One of the things I take away from this is the American government-sponsored education system has its own interests at heart. And there's an example of it. They've conned us about Lincoln all my short life. So.
Actually, let's open it up to discussion. Any comments
Yes.
that anybody wants to make about this? Yeah, Philip and Mark.
To pertain to your comment here is that the Constitution says United States of America. We use USA a lot, but it's very helpful to know that the United in the Constitution is small letters, and only the America is big letters.
And they're states, not individuals.
The states of America are capital letters. The United part is small letters in the Constitution, and so that sort of helps give the flavor of what was expected.
SA.
So USA is
SA.
it's just essay.
Yeah.
Mark, you had a comment?
It's just self-perpetuating, isn't it, that today, if we had a greater understanding of the dictatorial powers that presidents have assumed, that it would be sort of the seed, the fertilizer that it would take to actually knock the government back down to size, right? So it's important that you build up these monuments to heroes like Roosevelt, another one, right? Or Lincoln, right? We were just in Washington, D.C., right? The Jefferson Memorials, even though it's a good sized memorial, it's still concise. You read his excerpts from the Declaration of Independence, and you walk along the mall a little bit along the pond, and there's the Roosevelt Memorial, the FDR Memorial, which is a sprawling, incoherent bunch of granite blocks and waterfalls. It makes literally no sense when you look at it, and you find one of her most profound statements, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. And I'm standing there looking at it, I said, I know what it's supposed to mean, but if this is as good as it is, and it must cover 10 times the area of Jefferson Memorial, it's just to me that government has to build monuments to the guys that make government bigger.
That's right.
That's what you need to keep standing on the shoulders of giants. That's their ladder.
Yeah. I have another way of doing it. I come from a long time of radio, and radio is sound, and sound is the imagination of the mind. If you're driving along and you hear radio, you imagine what the people look like and what they're doing. And so I thought, now how would we characterize these two guys, Kamehameha and Lincoln? Well, Kamehameha would be, no, wait, I can't do that. And Lincoln would be boom, ah! So, and what that means is, Kamehameha had a few guns from the West, but he would club his enemies and then bop their heads, smash their heads in, smashing their heads. Lincoln would shoot and kill people.
Jeffrey, what's your thought about this?
I was just having the image of clubbing somebody's head.
Yeah, they say that. They say so-and-so, Chief so-and-so, who was disloyal to Kamehameha, was later sacrificed. And then I learned about sacrifice.
Gail, what's your comment on this?
I'm not gonna make any comment.
Oh, okay.
Did I disillusion you, sir?
Well,
Had you thought that Lincoln was a hero?
Not a history, it's not a story.
okay. Yeah. Rich.
You're learning from books.
I read a really great book recently. I like Andrew Napolitano,
Yeah.
and I recently read Teddy and Woodrow, which I heartily recommend to any. You won't be able to put it down if you like history. And it explained, why the mandatory public education system was created. And they thought these, upstart, stupid, ignorant immigrants, my grandparents, needed to be put in their place. And that's why we have mandatory public education in this country. We got along fine without it before then.
That's right.
Another, another way, and I think a lot about why. Why do people think this way? Well, I used to think that way. That's what I was taught when I was a kid. It's really, the system just perpetuates the lies, and there's more and more. The more you read, the more you study, the more you see. We've been lied to so many times.
It's discouraging.
Even like our monetary system is such a mess. People just accept it. The Federal Reserve is there to protect us, and that's a whole nother deal.
Well, but it isn't a whole other deal. Lincoln was the first to introduce fiat currency and to remove the country from the gold standard and sound money. Basically, he wanted to be able to print money to pay for his war because he knew that taxing to pay for it, people would have resisted.
And taxing really doesn't get you where. I think the government has grown because of the ability to just create money out of nothing. The fractional reserve system.
And he introduced the first progressive income tax, too.
Yeah.
Dave, what sort of thought do you have on this?
Well, this reminds me of a friend of mine who wanted to write a book on Lincoln, sort of debunking him. One of his favorite points was to point out that Lincoln's wife had inherited slaves from some of her southern relatives, and Lincoln, instead of freeing the slaves that his wife owned, he sold them. So he was a hypocrite in that sense. Though perhaps you can imagine that he underwent a change of heart after that, but it was conveniently after that he had collected the money.
I didn't know that. Wow. Arenda, you thought?
No,
No? Okay.
because the way we were taught in history, Lincoln was one of the greatest president. He emancipated the slave and he put the Union together. That's what we were taught in history. So when I first talked to Fred, so that surprised to me, because the history, what we are taught is, like he said, victory by the victor for the vanquished.
There you go.
When we were studying Hitler, we never knew till I came to this country that Hitler killed 7 million Jews. We were taught in history that Hitler was a great strategist, very unfortunate that he lost, otherwise he would have united the entire Europe.
Right.
That's what we did.
There's another uniter. How do you do it? You kill people.
Joseph Stalin was a great uniter.
Yeah.
I think it's quite interesting how many times the United States has gone on the side of countries seceding, in Kosovo, in Panama, in numerous cases where the United States, but when it was convenient to the United States to fight on the side of secession, they did, much in opposition to what they professed in this country. Kate, what sort of thought do you have on this?
I just think that Lincoln thing always puzzled me that so Fred, we are trying to say that because of this, the federal government becomes stronger. the
It
state
becomes what again?
stronger. So at the cost of the state, are you trying to suggest that?
I still didn't get the verb. It becomes
Stronger.
Stronger. Oh yes, by
I think
many
because The
times.
federal government becomes stronger as a result of the Civil War.
Yes.
At the cost of liberty of the.
To quote Randolph Bourne, warfare is the health of the state.
State grows bigger every time there's a war.
Right,
No matter-
and your liberties go
No matter
down.
what you call the war, call it the war on drugs,
Yes.
call it the war on terror. As soon as that word is in a sentence, you get smaller and the state gets bigger.
That's right. But Lincoln did it many times over. I mean, rather than going like this, he just straight up. I mean, all these things that, like what he mentioned. And I didn't talk about the economics. I had to make a decision not to talk about his economics, because truly, he was what we would call today a crony capitalist. He was all for huge government projects, and this is not to say that he did this theoretically. He actually backed them. He backed in Illinois in the 1830s as a young lawyer all sorts of huge government loans for projection of new railroads all around Illinois. Why? For the benevolent purpose of making commerce work. And that sounds right. That sounds good, right? If you're 8-year-old, doesn't that sound good?
And rewarding his friends.
But there was right after they did this, they pushed for the bill in Springfield, and they won, and they got the bill passed. And then there was a panic, and then all the money was retracted, and this government lost every one of these projects. Not a single dike, not a single railroad was built, and it was a collapse. And Lincoln didn't learn from this. Lincoln did the same thing on the federal level when he became president. Shortly after, how much after, I didn't check the time on this, was the National Railroad done on government money.
But it was started under his administration
There you
before. That's a difference. Yeah, okay.
Well, still, the founding fathers' Declaration of Independence is in contradiction with the freedom. All men created supposed to be equal, right?
That's right.
So that you say, this tension exists in the Declaration. So maybe that's why he was able to use this
Yes.
liberation of this slave as a way to solve the tension. And from the ideological point of view,
Yes, he
won
did.
the battle
Yeah.
against the majority of
Most of the people in the North, the so-called free states, didn't allow slavery, not because they thought of blacks as equals, but because they didn't want black competition with white labor. Many of the northern states didn't allow blacks to come in. Even if they did come, they didn't allow them to vote, they didn't allow them in property rights, they didn't allow them in many professions. They didn't want blacks there because they didn't like slavery because they thought it would compete with white labor.
The other thing that it's also the fault of the Southerners come up with better ideas to not give them the excuse, the pretense, and have their way to deal with the slave system.
Well, slavery was on its way out in the world.
Exactly.
And a friend of mine, her nephew, by the way, we were all sitting around a home in Linden, Washington, and he knew of my reputation for condemning Mr. Lincoln for what he did. And he said, I think you're wrong, Fred. And he starts raising his voice, and her sister gets all up to it. Oh, no, don't fight. I said, we like to fight. It's fun. And he says, you're wrong, you ugly slut. You don't know anything about this. And don't you dare call me an ignorant young man, because the war was worth it. They got rid of slavery. That's not the point, young man. 600, and now up to 850,000 lives to get rid of something that was already on its way out. You know, he knew nothing about what happened in Europe. Why didn't he? Because he went to government schools and they didn't teach him.
I have to say